The man sitting on the ledge in this photo is a very evil person, to say the least. What he did just prior to this is both unforgivable and incredibly disturbing, and he's about to pay the price for it. There's even a video to go with it. I'll tell you everything, but as usual, let me give you the backstory first. Thomas Perry Ballard is a 61-year-old man with a wife and son, living in a suburb in Sacramento, California. He's lived a very exciting life, and he's actually kind of seen as a black sheep of his family because he's always looking for something new or exciting. He'd been married on and off many times, lived across the United States working different odd jobs, and was a very explorative guy who couldn't be bagged down by the sort of traditional or expected ways of that time. As he started to get a bit older though, he'd meet his current wife Mira, and things would all change from there. He immediately knew there was something different about her. She brought a sort of teammate and comforting energy in a partner that Tom had been lacking in all of his partners up to this point, and it just felt right. She allowed him to truly use his creative tools and thrive in a way that he wasn't able to before. Naturally, things would progress and they'd eventually get married, where they'd move to Tulsa, Oklahoma together and have a child. His wife Mira was a very accomplished artist, they had the resources, and so they'd eventually end up starting a framing shop together. The business ended up being very successful. They'd earn more each month, become well known around town, and be able to pay themselves a good chunk after covering all the expenses. For Tom though, it just still wasn't internally satisfying. See, he was a very sporadic person and all, but he had one thing he loved more than anything, and he was sure that if he just did it, he would finally stop wanting to bounce around all the time. He knew when it came to Mira, he had to approach it slowly and in a very calculated manner, but she would surprisingly be willing to join, and so the small family would sell their business at the height of its success, and once again they'd move, this time into a suburb called Carmichael in Sacramento, California. Now you're probably wondering what it is that Tom wanted to do that warranted selling off a successful business and moving his family away from a place they loved again, so let me tell you. Believe it or not, it turns out Tom just wanted to be a librarian. He spent his whole life bouncing around and staying on the edge of excitement, but he was 61 now and he really just wanted to dial it back and focus on something he loved. He loved helping people and he loved reading. So that's what he did. They'd buy their new house and Tom would end up working at a new public library in Sacramento. The first few weeks went completely well. He'd get along with all his coworkers and adapt to the entire system, which at this point he was already very good at. Unfortunately though, things were going to take an extremely grim and unexpected turn. Tom's workplace, the Sacramento Public Library, was holding its grand opening on Sunday, April 18, 1993. The day went about as expected. There were programs for kids, coffee and food for the adults, and considering libraries aren't usually open on Sundays, it was a little extra busy. The 5 p.m. closing time was approaching, and some coworkers prepared to begin to bring everything in and start closing the library. While this was happening, out of nowhere, a man who had been hanging around the area walked in holding a firearm and people were ordered to hide. This man, 38-year-old Barrett Leon Street, said his wife had a poor interaction with one of the librarians and he was more than obviously angry about it. He walked up to the third floor, took out his handgun and fired several rounds at Tom, who was now hiding under a desk. Unfortunately, most of them would land in either his head or his chest and he wouldn't make it. Immediately following this, he walked up to another librarian, 43-year-old Sandra Pellos, and fired 2 more, taking her out as well. After this, the perpetrator walked out onto a rooftop patio where police had already had plenty of time to surround the building. And this brings us back to the video snapshot that I showed you earlier. Barrett would sit on this ledge yelling incoherent things at the police to where he eventually pointed his firearm in their direction. Authorities would promptly handle the situation, resulting in him being sent backwards over 5 stories to the street below. All of this was recorded by a nearby individual. And sadly, that's really where this story ends. All of this over a small dispute his wife had, which, by the way, we don't even know if this is true or if this man had a wife. It seems more likely that he was just in a bad state of mind, and many reports even claim he was a homeless individual who was having a bad day. We really don't know much about Barrett, and honestly, I don't care to. It's a very tragic case overall. In mid to late November of 1953, a group of workmen in a small town in Wales were out doing some work together in a field. They were clearing out a triangular plot of land to make space for an upcoming memorial hall that the town was going to erect. It wasn't a very quick or fun process, but it had to be done, and so the men would get outside into the cold and start to get after it. Part of the job was clearing out any empty garbage or used resources that were left there in the field, so they'd get after that first. They picked up everything from empty packages to metal feeding trays to even an old scarecrow that a farmer had up in the months preceding. See, like any construction job, there was no shortage of trash, and throughout the entire job, they would keep the pile building with plans to burn it all off at the very end. That way, they didn't have to keep making new piles or taking it away at the end of each day. Weeks later, on December 7th of 1953, their work on the site would eventually come to an end, and as expected, they'd begin to burn off the trash. The pile was now 6 feet high, and some of the guys were pumped to douse it and watch it burn off. Everything seemed normal at first, but while it was burning, one of them noticed something a little strange and peculiar that he just had to check out. He looked closely and he thought he saw what looked like the spine of a large animal falling out of some pieces of clothing that were sitting in the pile. He quickly snapped into reality though and realized that there's clothing there and animals don't wear clothing, so there could only be one thing going on here. See, what he thought was a scarecrow that they'd thrown onto the fire actually ended up being a real deceased person who was left in the area for some period of time. The police were immediately called and an investigation was launched. One of the investigators scoured the area and came across fragments with gray hair and a net on it, further cementing what the worker had already feared. They also found a wedding ring, a brown handbag, and more clothing items that belonged to an older woman. The dentures were tested, clothing was checked, and it ended up being a woman named Ethel Morris who was reported missing from her home earlier that year on July 21st. Her husband had woken up beside her, gotten up to make some breakfast in bed, and when he walked back into the room to give her some, she was simply just gone. He also said that she wasn't doing so well at the time, and that's why he'd offered to bring it into her. The handbag was analyzed, and they found a bottle containing some brandy, but they don't know if that has anything to do with it. Unfortunately, to this day, the case still remains unsolved and probably never will be. Some people theorize that she went on a walk to clear her mind and succumbed to the elements, but others think maybe there was foul play. But again, I don't think we'll ever know. This was almost 71 years ago now, and it's a very obscure case that is sealed away to time in a small Welsh village. Carl Jackson was a quiet 21-year-old data entry clerk for Morgan Stanley who was living in the Bronx in the 90s. He had a great head on his shoulders and was the son of two hardworking parents, a nurse and a postal worker. He didn't like to go out, especially on holidays, but if he had to, he had to. On Halloween night in 1998, Carl and his girlfriend were driving through their neighborhood to a nearby Halloween party to pick up his girlfriend's 9-year-old son. Before they could even get there, a very familiar thing had happened. A group of kids started throwing eggs at his car, which was par for the course on Halloween night in the Bronx at this time, but he still felt the need to pull over and try to teach these kids something. When he got out, the kids were hostile, bold, and naturally an argument ensued. They bickered back and forth, but at a certain point, he felt it was futile and not worth his energy, so Carl went to sit back down in his seat and get back on his way. His girlfriend was relieved too. It was at this point that one of the kids, 17-year-old Curtis Sterling, walked up to the window in anger and mercilessly fired a single round at Carl from the side of the car. All of this right in front of his girlfriend. The kids fled and emergency services would immediately be called. As expected, Carl would not make it. It created a devastating hole in his family and left one major question. How could something like this happen over something as simple as eggs? Well, it turns out this is not the first lethal incident in the Bronx involving eggings around that time. There's many examples, like this story where a 12-year-old was chased down by a guy leaving a bar who he'd egged, or this case where a 10-year-old was struck by a stray shot when he was in an egg fight, also on Halloween. Despite egging seeming relatively mild, they're seen as a massive inconvenience and insult, so if you hit the wrong person, you can expect some issues. Clerks are even told not to sell them to minors around certain times of the year as to prevent them from happening. By 1998, over a dozen casualties had already arisen as a result of egging-related incidents in New York City. Carl's mother, Gloria, said to the New York Times, "We never thought that anyone from our family would be taken away from us, especially on a holiday for something so stupid. I think it took us 2 years to even think about it. We were just devastated." Because he was only 17, the perpetrator, Curtis Sterling, was sentenced to a measly 20 years in prison, meaning he's more than likely out now. I have his inmate number, but no further details are online. Apparently, Carl's mother would send a card to Curtis every single Halloween saying, "I'm glad you're still in there." The family also gathers at his grave every year to talk to him and give him painted rocks. It's another story of a sad, senseless situation where someone good gets taken away too young. Most of this information is from 2010 and prior, so I hope since then the family has been doing a lot better. Thank you guys so much for watching, I really appreciate it. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing or giving a thumbs up, but if not, that's okay too. I upload 2 or 3 videos like this every week, so maybe I'll win you over next time. Also, huge shout out to all the people who already signed up for Patreon. I'm going to be starting a completely exclusive series there where I can be free and not have to worry about all the boundaries. I've already started working on it and I'm super pumped to show you guys it. I just want to stress though, if it's not within your means, don't feel any way obligated to support. Just watching is enough.